Human or machine? What's the difference? Is a question writers, directors, and even some philosophers have asked and tried to answer for years. As civilization advances more and more every single year, we might have to start thinking and asking the same question as well. What could it mean for the relationship between people and technology? Two games that come to mind when exploring this topic are Cyberpunk 2077 and Detroit Become Human. Why exactly? Because of their overarching theme of choice and why it's so important. Cyberpunk. Before it was a game, it was a genre. And before it was a genre, it was just a collection of ideas popularized throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s to be the antithesis to Walt Disney's utopian vision of a future where everyday problems are solved through the innovation of technology. This idea of a dystopian society, which at its core revolved around high-tech and low-life, inspired writers to visualize darker themes in works such as Blade Runner and Neuromancer. Eventually, in 1989, the culmination of these ideas inspired a young video game developer named Mike Pondsmith to design an iteration of a Dungeons & Dragons role-playing tabletop game called Cyberpunk that took place in a darker future, a version of 2013 from the perspective of the 80s. Mike's vision for a cyberpunk video game in the 80s and 90s was incredibly ambitious because of the technological limitations, but was also constantly shut down by developers, and even if they did like the idea, they would stray away from his original vision. Opposed to the traditional D&D gameplay where players are rewarded for doing good deeds to save the world, Cyberpunk embraced the greater, darker side of reality, because the main point of Cyberpunk is not to save the world, but to save yourself. Fast forward over 3 decades, and these ideas are still held true in the video game Cyberpunk 2077, where the main character V, a hard-headed mercenary who's trying to make a name for themselves in that city, is fighting for their life and selfless sense of identity, and is willing to go to extreme measures to do so. But the lengths she goes to are ultimately up to the player because every choice directly impacts the ending of the game. Like D&D, it's a choose-your-own-adventure game. In the first act of the game, we play as V, and are hired for a heist mission to steal some unknown technology in the form of a chip from the big scary corporation Arasaka. And just like every heist ever, something goes incredibly wrong. While trying to make her getaway, the case carrying the chip breaks, and if it's not kept at a certain temperature, it gets damaged. And since this is the future and everyone can link their brains up to a computer and plug a USB stick into their head, that's what V does to save the chip, unbeknownst to the dangers ahead of her. The chip holds an engram of Johnny Silverhand's consciousness, an infamous rocker boy and homeland terrorist who blew up Arasaka in the year 2023 because he is extremely anti-corporate and because of other personal reasons. His consciousness is now within the brain of V, but to say that they are coexisting would be a huge lie, since he tried to make V overdose to let him take control of her body. It's not as simple as removing the chip from her head now, because the purpose of the engram is to upload the consciousness to an empty vessel and override all information so they can live on into another body. The code of the chip sees V's consciousness as a virus and is now deleting her memory bit by bit. Now we spend the rest of the game trying to help V get Johnny out of her head.
We have a city to burn.
But moving on from humans and onto androids, the video game Detroit Become Human began its life as a 7-minute short film dropped in 2013 where one of the main characters, Kara, wakes up as she's being assembled, taking orders from a faceless voice that establishes her purpose of servitude in a lighthearted way. We see her suddenly get more excited at the prospect of being alive, only to be interrupted by the voice and being immediately disassembled because she showed emotion. It's only when she showed fear of dying after the wave of euphoria that she's just felt that she's granted mercy. This reveals her perspective on the human and android trope we see so often in sci-fi movies like I, Robot, and how she will eventually perceive herself. After the positive response to the self-contained story, David Cage, the director, was inspired to expand this idea what eventually became Detroit Become Human, a video game either loved or hated by many because of how much this visual novel felt like an interactive movie, more than a video game. But it's still able to raise the essential question of whether robots can ever become sentient or deserve rights. We play through the futuristic yet still somehow gentrified 2038 version of Detroit, Michigan, and are cycled between 3 main characters, who are all androids: police investigator Connor, housekeeper Kara, and caretaker Marcus. Each character has their own trials and tribulations, hardly if ever interact with one another, but all essentially are working towards the same goal: to live a better life free of the injustice and persecution of humans who wish to do them harm. Kara's default programming is to be a cleaning lady and nothing more, but she has a choice to either continue doing her job and watch as her owner continues to abuse her daughter, implying if this continues that she will die, or to protect her by taking her away and save her from her father. This goes against her protocol and shouldn't be able to help the little girl, but if she chooses to, then she is now considered a deviant, an android who bypasses the programming, thereby becoming a deviant android with full autonomy. Connor's job is to investigate the recent outbreak of deviant androids like Kara with his partner and understand why this is happening. Though along the way Connor himself can become defiant and sympathetic towards other androids or preservers programming like a good little robot, they're helping the androids' cause to fight for their independence or causing their downfall for the good of humanity according to his programming. It's universally accepted in this future that androids are only made to make human lives easier, can't show emotion, can't think for themselves, and have no rights whatsoever. This game draws a lot of parallels to slavery in the US, the racial injustice black people experienced, the Holocaust, and also to mention direct inspiration from the Bible. And what I mean by that is that the last main character somehow comes back to life after he's disassembled when he defects to protect the old man he was supposed to take care of, however he is framed for his alleged murder. After that he leads a deviant android army and is seen as the android messiah and their version of Martin Luther King Jr. or Malcolm X depending on the user's playstyle. Whether it's an identity crisis from internal conflicting personalities making you disassociate from your true self like in Cyberpunk, or self-doubt that your identity is valid caused from the people who don't want to understand you like in Detroit, I think it can be well received that one's qualities as an individual are more defined by their choices than any other thing. Let's take a look at Cyberpunk and how cybernetic enhancements can influence and change one's identity. Let me pose the famous thought experiment, the ship of Theseus, discussed by the likes of Heraclitus, Plato, and more recently Hobbes and John Locke. As followed, Theseus, the mythical king and hero of Athens, had used his new ship to set out to sea. When returned, however, a plank was damaged and needed to be replaced. As they journeyed more and more, the ship began to lose more planks and rot to extreme damage. If they were not replaced, the structural integrity of the ship would suffer. Eventually, every plank was replaced and none of the original pieces of wood remained. This posed the question, is this ship still the original ship of Theseus? Just like the ship of Theseus, people in Cyberpunk can replace their body parts for one reason or another, either voluntarily or because of health-related reasons. These cybernetic enhancements aren't limited to limbs, lungs, hearts, hands, eyes, skin, or internal operating software, which is incredibly invasive by directly being implemented into your brain. Of course, some people get an addiction to it and can become more artificial than natural. This may even cause cyberpsychosis, a mental illness, specifically a dissociative disorder caused by the overload of cybernetic augmentations to the body. And just like in real life, many people can't get the help they so desperately need and eventually become a danger to themselves and everyone around them. In the game, scientists say many lose control of themselves, but it's later revealed that they are very much so in control. One could argue both sides when comparing this example to the ship of Theseus and still be correct to an extent, but of course it's not much more different from the artificial limbs people have today. After all, they are still the same person. These changes don't make anyone less of a person. After all, every cell in our body is completely replaced after around 7 years. We're constantly being replaced by a newer version of ourselves. So maybe a person's body isn't what's so important when considering their identity. For example, John Locke was a believer in dualism, the idea that the mind and body are separate and that consciousness is what defines our identity. As long as we have the same stream of consciousness our entire lives, we are the same person. But how about when we go to sleep, our consciousness is interrupted? He then posed the memory theory, basically stating that our identity remains the same if we have a string of conscious memories. For example, when we wake up the next day, we're able to remember the past day, and that's what binds us to our past self. This is how identity can persist over time. Even if we don't remember when we were a kid, we remember a slightly the younger version of ourselves that can remember our days as children, hence the chain of memory. But how about people with dementia, and our protagonist V, whose memories are being erased and placed in someone else's memory? This theory also means we lose years of consciousness when we were babies due to none of us being conscious when we were born. Is there a definitive point where consciousness starts, or is it more like a gradient? Where would that put animal consciousness and a self-aware AI like in Detroit become human? Let's take another look at the ship of Theseus for a quick second. As every good shipwright knows, the cowl or the spine of the ship is the most important part when building the ship. It must be all one piece with no cracks from the same tree, and it cannot be replaced. It's accepted among sailors that once the cowl is damaged, the ship is on its last leg, and will die very soon. It cannot be replaced like the hull, and therefore is the exception to the ship of Theseus thought experiment. And like ships, once a person is considered brain dead, they are gone forever. The brain cannot yet be replaced, only slightly repaired. American philosopher Erik Olson supported this idea that bodily persistence is required for personal identity, assuming slight changes like constant replacements of cells are the exception. Now applying these ideas to Cyberpunk and Detroit Become Human, we know that for Johnny's case, his memories do persist. We are introduced to one of his exes, who despite knowing he died all those years ago, she sees the engram as not as a copy of him, but as the real him.
Okay, so it's 2015. If you could do it all again, what would you change? Anything at all?
I do everything in my power not to lose you.
He shows all his mannerisms and knowledge through V's body, though according to Erik Olson, since his consciousness shifted bodies, he's no longer the same person. But since V's old memories are also being replaced with Johnny's, she wouldn't be considered the same person according to John Locke's idea of the memory chain. In one of the endings, Johnny takes full control over V's body and overwrites her consciousness completely. This poses contradictions to both sides of the mind-body problem proposed by Descartes because as many of the characters in the game see it, he's no longer V, but is also no longer Johnny.
You forgot your guitar!
No, I didn't.
haven't forgotten a thing. Never will.
This begs the question, is he still considered conscious, and is he any less human? An idea that may help us understand what consciousness is ipsity, which is the fundamental experience of being embodied. This is especially important because it's been found that even people with dementia still have this feeling of being a body in a space. And a part of being embodied has to be thanks to the amount of sensory data coming in, because our senses do lend massively to the thoughts we have and influence our decisions. At some point, if we take away the sense, would we know if we are embodied? For example, there's been recent studies where the corpus callosum, the part of the brain that connects the two halves, was severed, and the two severed halves of the brain are functionally independent, somewhat becoming two different people and effectively dividing the consciousness.
Now, when a word or a picture falls to the left of a fixation point, that information goes to his disconnected right half brain. And as we can see here, Joe is unable to name it. Joe is able to draw the picture with his left hand, the left hand getting its major control from the right half brain. What'd you draw?
Car.
What'd you see?
Wheel on one side. I don't know where I saw another.
So even though he can't name it, his left hand is able to draw out a picture of the stimulus of the picture or word that we presented to his right half brain.
This is the main argument for monoism and the mind-body problem, but then is consciousness a material phenomenon? If it is, then that means on a subatomic level, all particles in the universe are conscious to some extent. It's just a matter of how fast they can communicate with each other like neurons in a brain or computer parts in androids. If we want to accept that Johnny and V are still people with their own identities, then we need to start asking if androids who can become autonomous also have their own identity, and therefore conscious, because this sense of ipsity and self-identity is essential to being alive and conscious and is not exclusive to just humans. But the one thing that remains constant no matter which ideology you think is right is the freedom of choice. Choice in both these video games play a huge role, being essential to the gameplay and can change the story to fit the player's personal alignment. In Detroit, the player feels the pain and sadness that the androids experience firsthand. You get to know why people would resent androids mostly due to displacement in certain workforces. This setting isn't too far off of what we may experience in our near future. It makes playing this game much more relatable and personal. Having to make morally challenging decisions and presenting possible consequences heavily influences the way many people would choose to play it, and will result in choosing a side, either human or machine or somewhere in between.
Okay, I think we're done here. Come on, Connor, let's go. Sorry to get you out
What's
of here.
more important to you, Connor? Your investigation or the life of this android?
It's up to the player to see through the ideas of whether androids are capable of ethical decisions. Put into perspective how much choice is emphasized in these games, all three of the playable characters in the game can be killed almost immediately from the beginning of the game. The consequences will result in effectively closing off a whole third of the story if the choices made lead to their deaths. But playing through the game, the same question persists. What is the function of machines, and can they develop free will? And how are they that different from humans?
You don't feel a thing, do you? A machine, that's what you are. You're just a fucking machine!
Cogito ergo sum, a philosophical statement made by René Descartes, more commonly known as I think, therefore I am. He always doubted certain beliefs and found that nothing is certain except for the fact that we are thinking beings, and we are therefore alive. This idea isn't limited to just humans, but includes animals and plants to a certain extent. So would it be too far-fetched to believe that androids who look, talk, and act like humans deserve the same respect as humans? I don't think it'd be too far of a stretch to say that as long as they are capable of making the same moral decisions as humans, then they are essentially the same as us. Though a point I would like to bring up is that there is a gameplay mechanic that basically slows down time, so it gives the androids more time to think about what the right choice is. This undermines the progress that androids made to become more human-like, because the purpose of a moral dilemma are that decisions are not made in a vacuum. Just like in the famous trolley problem, which set of people do choose to run over the tracks? Not having enough time to think it over and instead acting on instinct and your initial thoughts is supposed to reveal more about your true ethical nature, which is something inherently human. Whether the decision is more evil than good, it's human nature, and that's what Socrates described how humans are different from any other beings. As for Cyberpunk, the choices leading up to whatever ending you choose are constantly being questioned. We're always being asked, are they really your own choices? In one of the missions, V interrogates a scientist that made the engram that's in her head right now. He asks her if she's been making decisions that she otherwise wouldn't have after she put in the chip. He warns her that Johnny will start influencing her choices and may want to start taking full control of her.
Have you noticed the construct's influence on your decision-making?
Sheesh, give it a rest. When it comes to my decisions, Johnny really is just a voice in my head.
Sometime later, he does take control but to save her life. They have a heart-to-heart, and the time they spent together has made Johnny realize that when it comes down to it, he'll put down his life to save her, just like his old war buddy did for him. Whether the player chooses to reciprocate or not doesn't matter, so why does Johnny say this? It's possible that he no longer sees her as a threat, and their relationship is now more symbiotic than a parasitic one. How is Johnny's presence to V any more different from a friend trying to put their own input into influencing your choices? He appears like a schizophrenic ghost in her head, unable to control her without her consent, but nevertheless, he advises her on everything. Their case is special, of course, so how does this change V? From the beginning of the game, it's implied that she died but was saved by the chip, meant to bring life into an already dead body since she was shot in the head. So it's possible that it's her consciousness in her body. The chip thinks it's indistinguishable from Johnny. With that in mind and the other ideas I brought up, the conclusion befitting V's true identity is probably a mixture of V and Johnny's consciousness. From the moment he entered her mind, V is now Johnny, and Johnny is now V, regardless of which ending the player receives, because the choices made by them now makes up their identity and are permanently part of themselves. Neither of them are identical to one another, but they are in a way both the same, living through the player. Being able to experience these themes in a video game make the player directly responsible for the outcome. Their purpose is to be able to establish a deeper connection that you could if the same ideas were explored in a movie, book, or other media. Establishing this intimacy is important since the struggle of identity and consciousness has always been present in modern day human culture, and will probably continue to persist indefinitely, meaning it's up to us to determine how we will eventually tackle similar problems to come in the near future and understanding the significance of choice.